Hello, my name is Demille. Today is August the 2nd, 2026. I'm planning on doing a discussion on the humility of Moses because today is a Sunday, so as I do a deep dive into the Bible. But before I do that, I thought that I should uh, talk about uh, the Ten Commandments produced by Cecile Demille, which of course is considered the most successful historical and biblical epic in Hollywood history. In terms of financial results, it's it raked in about 122 over 122 million dollars in its original run in 1956. In today's money, that's about 1.5 billion dollars. And actually, the Guinness Book of Records uh, ranks it as that's the Ten Commandments ranks it as the eighth most uh, eighth best-selling movie of all time when tickets are adjusted for inflation, placing it uh, to roughly $2 billion, um, in total ticket receipts. Of course, it's appropriate to talk about epic releases in Hollywood, considering Christopher Nolan's release of The Odyssey, its success. Of course, Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey is just estimated or projected uh, that it is projected that it will become, within the top 15, top 13 best-selling movies of all time. But in any event, the best-selling historical and biblical epic of all time was The Ten Commandments, produced and directed by Cecil DeMille in 1956. It didn't win an Oscar, surprisingly, it did not win. Well, it did win an Oscar, sorry. It won an Oscar for Best Special Effects in the 1957 29th Academy Awards. But the Best Picture went to Around the World in 80 Days. Um, you know, Around the World in 80 Days, by the way, was a novel written by the French author Jules Verne. Interestingly, Ten Commandments was nominated for Best Picture, and a competing nominee for Best Picture was King and I. I've seen King and I loved it when I was growing up, and of course, Yul Brynner acted as the King of Siam, right? And Yul Brynner was also Ramses in Ten Commandments, right? So he was in two films that were up for Best Picture, which was a huge accomplishment back then. Uh, but coming back, just going back to the significance of the Ten Commandments, I want to say that Charlton Heston's portrayal of Moses actually inspired me to love the Bible as a child, right? Because I watched the Ten Commandments. It was very popular in my home. And I remember my younger sister and we would play, the final scene, right? I'd be playing Moses, and, my younger sister would play Joshua, right? It's funny what kids get up to. And, that we're, how old? I think I was about 6 years old at this time, 6, 7, yeah, 6 years old, 7. And, the final scene where Moses has his staff, I'd have and he asks Joshua to kneel, and Moses goes, and that's Charlton Heston playing Moses. He'd go, uh, Joshua, I charged you in strength, and you shall lead the people over Jordan, right? And Joshua goes, and as for me and my home, we shall serve the Lord, right? And then Moses walks off, and then he walks off towards the rock, right, towards the mountain, right there on the mountain. He's walking off to the cliff, and then he turns around and he lifts both hands up, and he raises both hands up, and he goes, "Go, proclaim liberty throughout all the lands thereof." Right? No, go proclaim liberty throughout all the lands and unto all the inhabitants thereof. Right? Yeah, that deep voice, and that was the final scene, right? And I remember somebody once contested, one disputed, saying that, well, that was just a fictionalized, those words were just fictionalized by Hollywood, that it wasn't in the Bible, right? And I want to prove that it was actually in the Bible, right? So I'm going to read from it. It's actually in the book of Leviticus, chapter 25, right? The only thing, right? So I'm is that the words weren't Moses' words, right? They were actually God's words, and we know Moses. Moses is said to have written Leviticus, right? The first five books of the Bible, they're called the Pentateuch, right? Written, and the author is supposed to have been Moses, right? So I'm just going to read from Leviticus chapter 25, Leviticus from verse 1, so we can see who said those words. It says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses in Mount Sinai, saying," right? And then we're just going to do, then it goes, verse 2 goes, "Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them," right? And we're just going to do an ellipsis, right? A huge ellipsis, and we're going to jump onto the second portion, the second sentence in verse 10. In verse 10, it says, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof." So there you go. But the words were from God to Moses, right? So it wasn't Moses. So God was telling Moses to say to the children of Israel, right? "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof." So Cecile B. Demille did a fantastic job. They said it was it was the biggest budget at that time in Hollywood, 14,000 extras, and he used over 15,000 animals. If you haven't seen it, you should watch it, and just to show how a great epic, right, when it's well produced, well directed in Hollywood, it can encourage people in to peruse, the original text that it comes from. So I was a child and I came to love the Bible at the time, right? I thought I should do this quick discussion because one, the historical aspect of it, and just considering that there's another, almost parallel success. Like I said, the Ten Commandments is considered the most successful historical and biblical epic in Hollywood history. The Guinness Book of Records ranks it as the eighth best-selling movie of all time, adjusted for inflation, right? When the ticket sales are readjusted for inflation, because of course it was released in 1956, and as I said, it did win, best special effects, right? So that was the only thing it won then. Another thing that the Ten Commandments is remarkable for, and that I wanted to point out, was when I think of a Moses, right, a biblical Moses, I don't know why. It's not just me, but we always think of Charlton Heston, right? It's astonishing that he didn't win best artist, right? Best actor. He did not win the Oscar for best actor because he played Moses. He gave us the impression of how Moses should have been. By the way, Cecile DeMille is, it is said that the first, his initial preference was Rock Hudson. If anybody remembers Rock Hudson turned out to be a closeted gay guy, right? I'm not bashing, it's not to bash or disparage homosexuality, but he ended up dying of AIDS. That's Rock Hudson. So it was just as well, because Ten Commandments it's played every year. It's a Christian favorite, right? And you can imagine, given its success, with the scandal of Rock Hudson, fell into later on because of the AIDS scandal. You can imagine the sort of backlash or the blowback that would have resulted. But in any event, Cecile DeMille ended up going with Charlton Heston, and it is said that the reason he went for Charlton Heston was when he saw Michelangelo's Moses. So I've lived in Italy before, by the way. I went to school in Italy, and so there's this great sculpture of Michelangelo by Michelangelo of Moses, right? A 1505 sculpture, and when Cecile DeMille is said to have seen it, he thought the sculpture had this uncanny resemblance with Charlton Heston, a bearded Charlton Heston, right? And it was like picture perfect. In fact, if you Google, you'll find there's actually a photo uh, of Michelangelo's Moses, the sculpture juxtaposed with the face of Charlton Heston as Moses in the Ten Commandments, and they look remarkably, uncannily alike. Very striking. And this was what hit Cecile DeMille. And Cecile DeMille is said to have remarked, right, exclaimed that if he was good enough for Michelangelo, he's good enough for him, because he thought, I don't know how he thought that in 1505, right, when Michelangelo had the sculpture done, there about 16th century in any event, that Michelangelo foresaw the face of Charlton Heston, right, as Moses, and that was what he sculpted, right? And so Cecile DeMille goes, if he was good enough for Michelangelo, he's good enough for me. That's of Charlton Heston's face. And Charlton Heston did a remarkable job, right? His composure, his countenance was just perfect, right? He had the authority, the presence of, of what you'd imagine a biblical Moses to have been, right? And something that's quite interesting, though, when you see the sculpture of Michelangelo, you notice it has two horns, though. Moses doesn't have two horns, and he was never portrayed as having horns. It's interesting, though, that the reason why Michelangelo had those horns was because of an error in translation from the Latin Vulgate Bible by the translator Saint Jerome. So after Moses had the encounter with God from the burning bush, the Bible says that his face was radiant, or there was a ray of light, right, that are emitted from his face, a ray of light. Apparently, the Hebrew roots, the translation cornura, that's what it was called, cornura, or horned, right? It's the same Hebrew word for the horn of an animal, right? The horns of an animal, right? It has the same root as ray of light. So there was a confusion in translation. So apparently for many centuries, right, readers and translators of the Bible, assumed Moses had horns. And this is for real. They assumed Moses, after he had the encounter with God, that he had horns. So that was an error in translation. So you can see the significance of studying the classics, mastering the classics, understanding the original language, which our founding fathers like James Madison did, right? James Madison, after he graduated from Princeton, it was called College of New Jersey then, he studied the classics, right? Again, the classics is the study of the Greek and Latin civilization, the language, in the original language, the original Greek and Latin language, and their civilization, their mythology. So you can see why they're trying to understand the people from way back then. And James Madison went on to he studied Hebrew as well. I think he took a year off as a graduate student studying Hebrew. You can see this was very impressive in the 18th century. So when I'm discussing Odysseus, later on in the week, you can see why, it's very interesting. Although I study the translations in the English language. Hopefully, maybe one day I'll have an opportunity to study the actual Hebrew language and Greek as well. And I started studying Latin during my wrongful detention. But in any event, I thought it was very interesting to just, do some kind of sidebar, provide a background into Hollywood's reception of the remarkable production by Cecile Demille of Ten Commandments, and the masterful portrayal of Charlton Heston as the biblical Moses. But this was just like a primer, a fun primer, because the next thing I'm going to do a video and get into the actual Bible passages concerning the humility of Moses. I want to try and just get directly into the Bible passages. So I'll just give a quick background. So when we see at the end of the Ten Commandments, and this is how it was in the Bible, right? Cecil DeMille did a fantastic job in his production. In the end, you see Moses telling his wife and Joshua and the acolytes, right? He was the leader of the Jewish people, of the Hebrew people then, of the Israelites, that's what they were called. And he was telling them how God was angry with him at the water of strife, right? If you don't know what the waters of strife, there's the water of strife, the water of Meribah, bitter waters. So Moses was constantly advocating for the children of Israel, right? The children of Israel, God would say the children of Israel were a stiff-necked people, right? Because every time they'd find, they'd encounter some little hardship in the wilderness, because God, their journey could have been just 11 days, but God took them through a long route, and it took them 40 years because God wanted to toughen them, test them, right? So it took them a long time. So anytime they faced some hardship, they would want to go back to Egypt, where they had been in bondage for over 400 years, and they would say that at least they were eating meat in Israel, and they'd want to stone Moses, right? Moses, who was always advocating for them, and they say things like Moses brought them out from Egypt so they would die in the wilderness, that were there not enough graves in Egypt for them to die. Now you see Cecil B. DeMille captures this in his movie in the Ten Commandments, right? And so it was there was a time they were complaining about water, and God told Moses, right, about to speak to the rock. But Moses was so angry because he had frustrated Moses so much, right? Moses was so angry, he was so frustrated, and then he ended up striking the rock, right? And so he disobeyed God. And Moses' relationship with God was sort of different. We'll see later on the Apostle Paul, he would talk about that not everybody desire to be a teacher, right? Or a leader, teacher, because there's more responsibility for you. So Moses had a lot of responsibility because the children of Israel were literally like his children. He was always pampering them, because even there was a time, and we're going to see this when we get into the passages about the humility of Moses, when God wanted to destroy them, and he said he wanted to have a new covenant with Moses, and Moses would say no, that he would appeal to God that no, then the enemies of God would say it's because he wasn't able to fulfill his promise to bring them to the promised land, right? So it's interesting that eventually Moses, the children of Israel provoked him, and he gets upset, and God, as a result, because he got upset and he didn't give glory to God, he didn't honor God, in his anger, God didn't let him get into the promised land, the place he had advocated for the children of Israel for. So he ended up not going to entering the promised land. And it's also very interesting that his older brother, who had at one time rebelled against him because he married an Ethiopian woman, that's in Numbers chapter 12, from verse 1, Aaron and his sister Miriam, who were older than Moses, had rebelled against Moses, right, saying, well, they too are prophets, right, and God was upset with them. Moses would appeal to God again, right, to relent. And then you would see, then later on, of course, when Moses went up to receive the Ten Commandments, you see Aaron would build the children of Israel the idol, the golden calf, right, and they would dishonor God and worship the golden calf, right. But God made the descendants of Aaron, right, Levite. His descendants were the Levites. Of course, Moses was a Levite as well. They were descendants of Amram and Yoshubel. But it wasn't Moses' direct descendants. We don't know what happened with Moses' direct descendants. But Aaron, his brother, who had committed all, the sin of building golden calf. At some point, he rebelled against the authority of Moses. His descendants were the ones that went on to become the Levites, right? The holy priesthood. And and then of course his assistant Joshua, his faithful assistant Joshua, was the one who went on to lead the children of Israel over the Jordan into the promised land. And Moses didn't get an opportunity to go into the promised land. He looked, he saw it, but he never went into it. So, but you can see, I guess that's what happens with the leader. Nevertheless, Moses was not a self-centered person. He wasn't self-absorbed. It didn't matter. He fulfilled his work, his task to the end, right? And so, I get excited, talking about Moses. Somebody else that Hollywood did a great job. Cecile B did a great job, and where there was the Charlton Heston, right, to be able to give us a character, right? This is not idolatry, because Moses is not a god, or he's not portraying God or anything. Now, we've had a great Hollywood character in Moses. We've had another great biblical character, someone who played Jesus Christ. That's Robert Powell in Franco Zeffirelli's masterpiece, Jesus of Nazareth, which they play every year as well during Easter. But we don't have a masterful Paul. I saw I saw a portrayal of Paul, and I fell asleep. I've never been able to watch it through. But I hope Hollywood creates an epic, a masterful portrayal of the Apostle Paul, right? So it can get people excited about the writings of Apostle Paul as well, just as the Ten Commandments got many people excited about, the Old Testament. My name's Oluro Timiosha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.